Hello. In the video that follows, I demonstrate an Excel bill-paying reminder system that uses Excel functions and Visual Basic for applications. I use it in my Excel Power Query checkbook. I hope you find it useful.
This video demonstrates the creation of a reminder system in Excel for bills to be paid. The example uses tax reminders done on a quarterly basis, but it can be adjusted for any kind of timing for any kinds of bills. The first worksheet sets up the notification time segments, and we're going to go through that process right now. I have taken the liberty of typing in some of the pieces that just get typed in. So here are my quarters. They started March, June, and September and December. There is a month list, which we'll get to in a minute, to create the specific days that we want the reminders to appear. So we start with a year, which is going to go in this cell, and we're just going to get the year of today. So we use the year function and the today function. So whatever day it is, we'll get the current year. And we'll bold this. And now when we create our dates in which the reminders will appear, we're going to use a little table here from the month days. And the only day that has to be calculated is February because of the leap year situation. And we're going to just determine the number of days in February from whatever the current year is. We'll use the mod function so that we can determine if the year is evenly divisible by 4, but while that would suffice for the useful life of this worksheet, we're going to take a little more extensive calculation so that it will always be correct, because when the Gregorian calendar replaced the Julian calendar in 1582, leap years for century years only occur when those years are evenly divisible by 400. And so an evenly divisible by 4 doesn't work in 2100, even though that isn't particularly relevant to this worksheet. We're going to use a fully accurate calculation of the days in February. So let's click in the February cell. And we'll start out with an if statement. And the first thing to determine is, are we in a century year? So that means, are we evenly divisible by 400? And we use the mod function, which just gives us the remainder. We're going to use the cell C1, and we're going to F4 it because we always want that to be an absolute address. Our divisor is going to be 100, and if it equals 0, then it's a century year. So if it's 0, then we check to see if it's evenly divisible by 400. So that's another if statement. Back to the mod function, back to C1. And now our divisor is 400. If that equals 0, if we're in a century year and it's evenly divisible by 400, there are 29 days in February. Otherwise, there are 28. And finally, if we're not in a century year, that's our last if, then we just have to see if it's evenly divisible by 4. Which we have here. So if the mod equals 0 in that case, then it's a leap year and it's 29 days. Otherwise, it's 28. Close off that last if and the first one. So that should be an accurate rendition of the proper calculation of leap years, and that will extend in perpetuity. So now we make this a table. And home, we're going to format it as a table. It has headers. And the table is going to be named TBL month. And now we can use that in our notification segments here. The first thing to do is get the month number, and that should be easily done with a match function. So we just need to match the month to the left here in table month, and the column we want is the month column. So once we get that match, it'll tell us it's the third month. And then we just drag down and get the rest of the month numbers. Now the first day and the last day just depends on when we want to see the reminders. And the only reason for the days column in the month table is in case we want to go to the end of the month for whatever reason, and then we'll get the right day in February. But in this case, since we're going to pay our taxes in the middle of the month, we're going to start on the first day, and we're going to end on the 13th day. That should give us enough notification to pay taxes in a timely way. So I'm just going to copy that down. So I'm going to drag and hit Control D, which is copy down. And they'll all be on the 1st through the 13th day of the designated month in which we're going to pay the taxes. So now we just get the dates from those entries. So let's put in the calculation for the first date, and that equals the date. And the year is going to be the year right here, and that's got to be absolute address, so I'm going to use the F4 key to do that. Then the month will be the month from the B column, and since my last date wants the month from the same column, I'm just going to make the B absolute. I'm going to keep the row relative, but I'm going to make the column absolute. So I'm going to go through the F4 key until I get a $ on the B, but no $ on the 3. And then finally, I need the day, and that's going to be here in the C column. I'm going to leave that relative because when I drag it across for the last date, I want it to go to the D column. And that should give me my March 1st date. And it does, and if I pull it across, I should get March 12th. Let's see if I do. March 13th, excuse me. And I do, and now this should be no problem dragging down here. The pound signs simply mean my columns aren't wide enough to accommodate the entries. So that's the time segment notifications, and now we know which dates will prompt a reminder to go ahead and pay the taxes. By the way, the movement of the Julian to the Gregorian calendar is a fascinating read of human ingenuity. So if you do want to learn more about that, just go ahead and use your favorite search engine and go ahead and look up October of 1582, because that's when the changeover was made, and they just took 10 days out of the month of October to try to get the calendar to more closely reflect the actual orbit of the Earth around the Sun. Okay, we will continue on. Let's make this a little bit more attractive. I think we're going to go on the right side here. And now we have the reminder sheet ready, and we're ready to get the reminders to appear in the location where we want to see them. So I'll create another worksheet. I'll call it transactions because normally it's the transaction sheet that will show the reminders. And I'll put a reminder cell here. Make this a little bigger. And have today is, and then we'll make something big enough here as well. So the reminder is going to appear here, starting in the C column, in a sheet where we're tracking transactions. And that comes in other videos where we describe the electronic checkbook transaction sheet. But let's start with today here. And in this case, we're going to format it not in short date format. We're going to in long date format. So we know what today is. The reminder cell is going to be in C1. Now the if statement is going to get a little long because we're going to nest for and functions inside an or function. So let me go back to the reminder sheet just to see that the first date for the first quarter will be E3, and the last date will be F3, and then the next quarter is E4, F4, E5, F5, E6, F6, just so that we can see how the pattern works. Let's go back to here and start our if statement right here. We have an if, and now we have the or, and we're going to nest those 5 ands. So we start one and we're looking at the date, today's date, and we want that to be an absolute address. And we want it to be greater than or equal to our first date, and that's the reminder sheet. This one's E3. And then we want it to be less than or equal to the end date. So once again, we have D2, and it's an absolute address, is less than or equal to. Reminder is F3. And we just repeat this pattern throughout the E4, F4, E5, F5, E6, F6. So in order to do that, I'm going to take this whole and here and like that, copy it, Control C, and then stick it after my last statement and change the 3s to 4s. We'll do that again. Change the 3s to 5s. And finally, they have to be 6s. There we go. So now we close off the OR. And if those are true, we're going to check the tax. If they're not true, not putting anything in that cell. Just for checking, I will take the last date in March and I'm going to make it the 30th instead of the 13th. And in that case, we should see the check tax. There's the 30th. Go back to transactions and we see the check tax. Now we should also make it prominent. So let's pull this out a little bit. Put this in bold and make it red. So when it appears, it will be red. And let's go back to the reminders, take it back to the 13th, and we should not see the check tax in C1 anymore. And we see it's not there. I'm going to move the transaction sheet first because it normally would appear here. And the last part of this reminder process is an Excel macro that in the right time period will display a message box that says, time to look at taxes. And we'll look at that code next. Before we create the macro, we should have a way of allowing the user to determine whether the reminders should show up or not, or at least the macro reminders, the pop-up message box. So we have one more sheet that we're going to put in. That's going to be our file sheet. Again, this will be incorporated further into the electronic checkbook, but for now we're just concentrating on the reminders. And we'll get larger type in here. Okay, this is going to tell us whether that reminder is going to show up or not. And in order to do that, let's go make this a little bigger. That's good. And this one is going to have data validation and just say on or off. So I need data. Here's our data validation, and it's going to be from a list, and it's simply going to be either on or off. And then we can choose either. Let's make that bigger. We'll center it and bold it. And also, we'll give it a little color, so we'll conditionally format it. And that will be text contains. So if it contains off, we're going to make it red. So let's custom format it. We'll have the fill color to be red. And otherwise, if it contains, well, that's our red. Now we'll give one more rule on the conditional formatting, so we'll manage the rules. And that's going to be, so specific text, if it contains on, then we'll make that green. Okay, so if it's on, it's green. If it's off, it's red. That's fine. Let's see if that works. And it does. So we'll leave it on for now, and we'll move on to the macro. So we need the developer tab showing. If you don't see the developer tab, it's under File and Options and Customize the ribbon, and then you look for the developer checkbox and you just check it. But in the developer tab, we'll go to the Visual Basic Editor, and in the Visual Basic Editor, we can see in this workbook, whoops, right here, in this workbook, we're going to choose Workbook Open so that whenever the workbook is open, the macro runs. And let's go over the code that's in there right now. The dim statements, the dimension statements are always where we declare variables in VBA code. And we have some strings. We have some variables that'll be worksheets. We have a range. And then we have one integer here. So the set command is used when we assign a variable to an object. So WS becomes the worksheet files. WS1 is worksheet transactions. And then we have some messages. And this is the title of the message box. So basically we're looking at, the first thing we're looking at is if we've chosen off in row 1, column 2, which is B1. If that's off, then we just get out of the macro. We don't do anything. And that's why we won't see a message when we have chosen off. If we haven't chosen off, then we will check cell C1 in the transaction sheet. If it says check tax, then we'll get out if the E column, the first row E column says paid. Otherwise, the message box comes up asking if you want to mark it paid. And if you want to mark it paid, it'll put paid in E1. If we're beyond the time, so there is no check tax appearing. It'll just make sure that there is no entry in E1. And that's the macro. And it runs as soon as the workbook is open, so it will remind us about the taxes if we choose to be reminded. Okay, we're going to go ahead and put that into this workbook. Go to the Visual Basic Editor on this workbook. Into this workbook container for the macros. I'm going to choose Workbook and Open. And now I happen to have that code right here. Control C to copy. Control V to paste. And that's it.